Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today we're going to find out if it's possible to create a perfect clinical test. This is something I think we all want to know if that's possible. And I've asked Jeremy Stackawitz, CEO of Senzo, to answer what I expect is a rather complex question. So easy question, maybe a complex answer. So with 25 years of industry and 15 years of diagnostic experience, I think Jeremy will be our perfect guide to try to answer this question. So Jeremy, thanks for agreeing to take on this challenge, and I can't wait to find out the answer.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be on with you today. We'll endeavor to answer it together.
Okay, sounds good to me. All right, so the idea for a so-called perfect test isn't something I dreamed up for this podcast. It's an idea that was developed by the World Health Organization. The affordable, sensitive, specific, user-friendly, rapid, and robust, equipment-free deliverable to end users, or A.S.U.R.E.D, we're going to refer to it as A.S.U.R.E.D throughout the rest of the recording, criteria for point-of-care diagnostics was originally developed in 2003 to guide affordable test development for resource-limited settings that lacked access to laboratories for population-scale diagnostics. That's a lot of stuff there. So, Jeremy, could you maybe nail this down? And what was the operating premise here? Is this just some sort of idealized framework that someone just dreamed up over a cup of coffee or a cocktail, or is this something that who thought was achievable?
Yes, I think a little bit of both. I think it was a little bit to spur industry, to be honest.
Okay.
I have not, I must say, I've not spoken to anyone at WHO who was there at the time when they came up with this. We have spoken with WHO and are working with them on some things, but I think the idea was really to punctuate the point that tests that get developed for the US and for Europe may suit that economic structure, delivery structure, clinical structure, but that may leave out some places in the developing world that the WHO particularly cares about. And so it was almost, I saw it as a reminder to industry that there are other people and areas that need help, and that things like affordability and equipment free, which may not be relevant when you're selling into a hospital system in Illinois, is very, very important when you're trying to deliver diagnostics for HIV or tropical diseases in a remote part of India. And so I think a lot of this was really framed around that. It was a sort of a siren right out to industry to say there's a big unmet need here. And while sensitive and specific is great, maybe we can even sacrifice a little on those parameters to make them more affordable and available to a target group. Tuberculosis is usually the disease that is kind of the one that gets referred to a lot around this criteria, and rightly so. It still unbelievably kills 1 million people a year, and there are great treatments for tuberculosis. The issue is almost entirely in diagnosis, and that extends to a variety of other tropical diseases. HIV in particular, I think, is a good example in the other way, where with PEPFAR and other things, a sustained investment and understanding around there has really gone a long way and made huge improvements, but there are a lot of other areas that still need focus.
Right. And just to kind of piggyback on that with affordability, that also involves access. And there was I'm sure you saw this a few years ago. I talk about it all the time on the podcast and in other areas, that the Lancet survey that they did a few years ago, about 40% of the world's population, including the United States, does not have access to basic diagnostic tests. And I think that probably fits in with the A.S.U.R.E.D criteria, in terms of having things that are available, point of care, and then of course access to these tests, which affordability is a big part of it, particularly in rural areas in the United States and in lower income areas in the United States and in the developing world, and other places across the world as well.
That's right. And I think, ultimately the devil's in the detail, right? As is often the case. And I think you look at this as an overall framework that makes sense medically, clinically, and and the development of products and technologies should be oriented this way. Senzo tries to orient their thinking around this framework. But at the end of the day, right, you're not creating a test for a framework. You're creating a specific test for a specific geography and a specific clinical need. And so, frankly, what's needed to do, uh, you know, a cholesterol test as part of your yearly physical, that is a very different animal than providing tuberculosis screening in Africa, right? And
Right.
so it's probably okay if your cholesterol screening is a little bit expensive by certainly developing world standards, or that it's not equipment free and that it does take 4 or 5 days to get back. It still
Right.
is fit for purpose, right? But I think the opposite isn't necessarily true. If you take that model of, a huge amount of the testing that occurs in the US still is related to inpatient hospital testing, right? It takes place in that hospital. You're a patient. The parameters needed there are vastly different than when you're trying to bring testing to the masses. Even in the US, right? Um,
Yeah.
I think of hepatitis C testing, right? Which again,
Right.
there's millions of undiagnosed baby boomers with hep C. For a long time, the treatments weren't very good. So even if you were diagnosed, there wasn't that much you could do about it. That's changed completely, right? Every day that you have hep C that is untreated, uh, you know, you are getting worse. And there are good treatments that can halt that, reverse that, improve quality of life, improve outcomes. But if you're not diagnosed, you're you're not able to access that treatment. These people tend to not be inpatient, right? They're not necessarily presenting with an acute issue, and so what you might need to develop to reach a population, and hep C has a big overlap with indigent populations, things like that. So, how do you
Hmm.
bring a good hep C test to the place where these people can access it, right? Whether that's a clinic, whether that's an inexpensive point of care, or even buy it on Amazon test, right? Um,
Right.
Sexual health, sexually transmitted diseases fall into
Hmm.
that. There's a stigma, there's an embarrassment factor. So you can say, yeah, there's sensitive, specific, maybe even affordable with your copay tests that can be run in central labs on instruments. But if that population doesn't ever present to their physician, it doesn't much matter, right? So sometimes you have to meet the patient where they are, and sometimes that means financially, sometimes that means logistically, sometimes both. And I think that's the way I look at this framework. WHO is just trying to paint, I think there's no one answer, um, but you have to look at the individual test and situation and geography and patient population.
Right. And we talked a little bit in the pre-interview about, things have changed in the last 20 years, certainly. We had a global pandemic. Over-the-counter testing is becoming more prevalent, et cetera. So how has testing changed over the last 20 years to either help achieve these goals or make them harder to achieve?
Yeah, I think we were on our way leading into the COVID pandemic. I think the COVID pandemic accelerated what I'll call point of care more broadly, right?
Right.
Point of care is
Right.
not new. There are, the big players, most notably Abbott, right, have had point of care
Hmm.
uh, technologies, platforms that millions of tests are run every year. They are sensitive, specific, affordable. becomes a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? But but they are also limited to specific test groupings and specific populations that could access them. I think the big change with COVID was the at-home testing, right? Where
Right.
um, I think we all kind of saw the benefit of being able to take that into your own hands, that people can be trusted with doing testing, interpreting the results, and making decisions, sometimes in conjunction with their physician, sometimes not. And I think people want more of that. I think, frankly, healthcare providers want more of that. It takes a burden off of inpatient in-person visits. You can flex to teledoc visits. So all of these technologies are kind of coming together in the U.S. and Europe. But you do see kind of the trickle down effect as well, where that technology and the lowering of costs are able to bring that to so some of the other lower income areas that need it. And ultimately, that's it's a convenience issue perhaps in the US. It's a much more of a life and death issue in other geographies, where the
Right.
only chance they're going to get testing is if you bring you know a $1 test in the back of a pickup truck into an area where people are. And so
Right.
again, it's a little bit, every test and every situation is different. And all of these things are relative, right? Even sensitivity, certainly for some well trodden tests, to get through the FDA and have a test that is trusted by to get FDA approval and trusted by clinicians, you got to have 98, 99% sensitivity and specificity.
Wow.
On the other hand, if it's an area where the diagnostics have been traditionally lacking, maybe it's a new marker for lung cancer. And if the next best marker is 60% sensitive, well, if your test is 70, that's an incremental improvement, right? So all of these things
Right.
are relative to what's your next best choice, I think, is kind
Right.
of what ends up happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's not leave the audience in suspense any longer. I hate it when you tease something like this. You wait all the way to the end. So let's do this in the middle. Is there a perfect test? Does a perfect test exist? At least according to the assured guidelines from WHO.
I think the perfect test exists for a given clinical scenario. I think certainly it's aspirational for all of us on the side of developing tests. I think we should
Okay.
aspire for the perfect test. I think at times it makes sense to, um, strive for perfect and get to excellent. um, which is an okay outcome, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
especially if the current state of affairs is mediocre. Excellent is maybe not perfect, but it is better. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of what WHO was trying to create here, is a push for more development and ticking the boxes of these. But yeah, I think certainly, again, I use the kind of uh, you go to a yearly physical and you're going to get a blood draw and it's going to get sent to a LabCorp request, and it's relatively straightforward. You get your blood counts, your cholesterol, your enzymes, your lipids. It works pretty well, right?
Yeah.
The tests are accurate. um, I would argue that it is, you know, this is where I put my point of care hat on. I do think it is
Hmm.
strange that we go into our physician, we haven't seen them in a year in some cases, right? Neither of us know anything. We have a chat for a while, and then we leave with a script to then get a diagnostic to get all the information you should have been talking about. And then, unless something is terribly wrong, you don't talk to them again. Uh,
Right.
so,
Right.
um, I do think that's the benefit of point of care technology, where you can imagine
Yeah.
you walk in, when you check into your doctor, you get a nasal swab or a finger prick blood draw. They run it in 15 minutes while you're in the waiting room, and then you go in and discuss the results with your physician. I think that makes inherently more sense. I think that is absolutely where the system is headed in Europe and the US. The technology needs to catch up a little bit, but you're going to be able to do that in your primary care doc's office, in an urgent care center, probably even at Walmart in the pharmacy,
Yeah.
with the pharmacist. So that's the way things are
Yeah.
headed, and I think that's maybe not exactly what WHO had in mind, but it sort of fits this criteria as well of user friendly, right?
Right.
Rapid,
Right.
deliverable.
Right.
So all of these take on different things depending on what you're looking to get from it.
Right. And now we talked again in the pre-interview a little bit of that. Yeah, these criteria are now over 20 years old. Uh, does A.S.U.R.E.D need to be updated? Does the criteria need to be updated, or is it still a good framework to work through? Particularly for folks like you at Senzo. We'll talk a little bit about what you're doing in a second. But
Yeah.
does the criteria need to be updated? Do you think?
No, I think these are the right seven parameters. I think I think it sort of comes down to each use case and clinical case. The seven criteria get weighted differently, right? In some
Mm,
cases, affordable is way more important than rapid and robust, or vice versa. But I think this is a good framework. I think it ticks all the important boxes of what's important to the patient, to the outcome of the testing, to the delivery system, to the financial system supporting the healthcare dollars. So I like the framework, and again, I think it's you don't necessarily have to check every one of these seven boxes perfectly to have a good test. It just has to
right.
be incrementally better than what's currently available, and that's sometimes a breakthrough, right?
Yeah, it kind of gives you that it's kind of like a pointer to that North Star ideal. It seems like to me from what we're talking about here, what we talked about in the pre-interview.
Yeah.
All right, all right. So talk to me how you use Assured at Senzo. I mean, how do you use that as your pointer to that North Star in developing the test that you develop at Senzo? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I think if we look at this under the context of, say, Senzo is working on point of care, but specifically at home tests. Largely, we're focused on infectious disease. Our test platform, ALF, Amplified Lateral Flow, is a yes/no test. So picture COVID or
Okay.
flu, right? Some tests like cholesterol or enzymes or lipids, you need a quantitative readout, and so you're inherently going to need some amount of instrumentation. We're working on a point of care lateral flow platform that's yes/no, very low cost, quick time to result, very user friendly, um, and highly accurate. And I think that's the important part. Where you're going to see the movement again in the US and Europe is from testing that occurs today, vast majority in central reference labs. If you're an outpatient, right? If you're not in a hospital, it's running through LabCorp and Quest. Um, and that's great in some ways, but it does, as some of the examples we already discussed, it's pretty expensive, and you're waiting a couple of days, and in some cases you can't wait a
Hmm.
couple of days. If you're septic, like, you need to know
Right.
immediately. um, and frankly, even things like that are more less lethal, more mundane, but flu, right? Anything where an antiviral can work. um, we use the flu example a lot. Tamiflu is a great drug. You will suffer for 4 days instead of 7 days if you have the flu. It's been out
Right.
forever, and nobody uses it. And the reason is because no one wants to drag themselves out of bed to their doctor's office. Your doctor doesn't want you there either to get a
Right.
prescription for Tamiflu. And so it's an easy one where if you have a test sitting in your medicine cabinet and you can get a result that, yes, you're positive for flu in 10 minutes, right? It's a $10 test,
Hmm.
10 minutes. The key, though, is it can't be a worse test than the one you would get if you were sending it away to a central lab. Because if
Right.
all your doctor says is, yeah, maybe, but sensitivity is 60%, I'm going to have you take a real test. Why don't you come on in? You
Right.
haven't provided any value. You've just added time and cost on the front end, and you're back to the original problem, which is you don't want to get out of bed because you have the flu, or your kid does, right?
Yeah.
So you
Yeah.
need it to be actionable, and so that for us is the key part of at-home tests. It needs to meet the criteria. Literally, our clinical trials will be going head to head as a comparator to the gold standard test for that disease, which is
Mm.
often molecular central lab run on a giant analyzer, right? But we need to be able to match those results to get through the FDA, but so that physicians can rely on that to then maybe in a teledoc visit write a script. And so that you can, from waking up and not feeling good or your kid not feeling good, in an hour, you've gone from taking the test, had a teledoc visit, and now you've got a script and it can be actionable.
Yeah.
So we kind of look at this criteria. We're inherently affordable, deliverable, rapid, equipment free. So we check all those, user friendly. Um, the challenge with at home testing and lateral flow testing is the sensitivity and specificity. And that's been the historical, you can have all these other things, but you can't also have that. Or if you want something and
Right.
specific, then it's not going to be rapid or affordable. So,
Right.
traditionally, this is a trade off. And I think maybe, again, that's the WHO inspiration of, well, maybe as technologies evolve, we don't have to make a trade off and you can have kind of tick all of these boxes at once.
Yeah, or the most of them. I know we talked about this in the pre-interview. I brought this up with my doctor a few times on a couple of different tests. I said, "Well, could I do this or do this?" Or I read about this, and he says, "Yeah, but it's not sensitive enough." Or yeah, you can do that, but if it's positive, you're going to have to do this more invasive test anyway. So let's just get it out of the way and do the more invasive test first,
Right.
just because the sensitivity isn't high enough. And one test in particular says that sensitivity is just isn't high enough. So we'll do the tried and true.
Yep.
And I said, okay,
Yep.
that sounds good to me because I don't want to have to get tested twice. Both for the time and the
Right.
expense, which are both are two very valuable things for a patient.
Yep. No, I think
And
that's exactly right. And again, it used to be the case where you could also test for things that then you couldn't do anything about it, right? It's the old,
right,
if you if there was a way to know magically the day you were going to die, would you want to know? There's a little bit
yeah,
of if you can diagnose something but then can't treat it, is that valuable? But I think in the last 25 years, therapeutics in some ways have kind of bypassed diagnostics, where you have more
yeah.
cases now where you've got the rate limiting step to people being better and treated and healthier is actually finding them and diagnosing them, not the ability to treat.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I always like to end on a forward-looking note. So, get ready to dust off your crystal ball here. What does assured look like in about 5 to 10 years? And will we have that perfect test? Will we hit all 7 criteria, or do you think it's still going to be an aspirational roadway?
Yeah, I'm going to hedge a little bit and say it will
Okay.
always be aspirational in a sense that there will always be a better way to, uh, diagnose colorectal cancer or lung cancer,
Right.
or, there are some things where we're a long way from a perfect test and it's just going to be iterative. And probably in 20 years, it's still going to be iterative. But
Right.
I think in 20 years, we're going to be a lot further along that pathway. And I think, particularly around point of care, at home, deliverable technologies, we've made huge strides in the last 10 years, and that will just keep going. And I think, we're already seeing that with some at home molecular lamp type technologies. Their challenges are largely cost, but cost
Mm-hmm.
tends to get figured out. And so I can imagine that that becomes much more commonplace in the US and Europe, but that it also trickles down to where this can be delivered in lower income areas. So I think we will, um, on an individual test and application, we're going to have dozens of tests that we don't have today that are going to have huge impacts on health and outcomes for patients. And then there's still going to be more work to do.
Right, right. There always is. Every time you think you get to the end, there was that guy, what, it was 100+ years ago, said, "Oh, we've invented everything that could be invented," and I'd like to, bring him forward in time and say, "Look, you were really wrong," and 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 anyone who says that today is probably really, really wrong too. So, with that, we've unfortunately come to the end of our time. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining me today. I don't know if we've answered the question exactly, but I think we've certainly covered some really intriguing ground. And I think talking about the framework was really interesting and I think really important in terms of what companies like Senzo are doing in terms of using that criteria to create tests that fit these criteria that are affordable and sensitive and specific, etc. Thank you for sharing that, and maybe we'll revisit. Maybe if you invent the perfect test, we'll have you on again.
That's I'll
So
take you up on that. I appreciate it, Chris. Thanks
okay,
for the time.
excellent, excellent. And I also want to thank you, the laboratory audience, for listening and continuing to listen. Look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future and visit us online at clpmag.com and on all the major social media platforms. So until next time, be well.